Thomas Everett stood at the window of his small apartment, watching raindrops race down the glass. At 42, he was accomplished by conventional standards, a respected psychology professor with published papers and a comfortable life. Yet, something fundamental was missing. The bookshelf behind him overflowed with volumes on analytical psychology, with Jung's collected works forming the centerpiece. Thomas had spent years studying the Swiss psychologist's theories, fascinated by the concepts of the collective unconscious, archetypes, and the shadow self. But lately, these academic pursuits felt hollow. His phone buzzed with a message from the university dean about an upcoming conference on Jungian psychology in Zurich. Thomas stared at the invitation, feeling the weight of a decision that seemed to extend beyond a mere professional opportunity. Perhaps, he whispered to himself, it's time to seek beyond the pages. The lecture hall in Zurich hummed with intellectual energy as scholars from around the world gathered to discuss Jung's legacy. Thomas sat near the back, observing more than participating, until a woman's voice cut through his thoughts during a heated debate about the anima concept. Jung didn't see the anima as merely the feminine aspect within men, she argued, her voice carrying a slight accent Thomas couldn't place. He saw it as the bridge to the unconscious, to everything we refuse to recognize in ourselves. Her name was Elena Vasquez, a Chilean-Swiss psychotherapist whose perspectives on Jungian archetypes challenged orthodox interpretations. Something about her presence, confident yet vulnerable, intellectual yet deeply intuitive, resonated with Thomas in ways he couldn't articulate. Over coffee after the session, their conversation flowed effortlessly from academic discourse to personal philosophy. Thomas found himself sharing thoughts he'd never voiced aloud, while Elena listened with an attentiveness that made him feel truly seen. We project onto others what we cannot yet recognize in ourselves, she said as they parted. Jung called it the mirror of the self. Perhaps we'll find more reflections to explore tomorrow. Their connection deepened over the following days as the conference continued. Thomas found himself drawn to Elena's perspective. Her integration of Jungian theory with practical therapy, her willingness to challenge established interpretations, her authentic engagement with her own psychological process. You've studied Jung extensively, she noted as they walked along Lake Zurich one evening. But have you done the inner work he advocated? Have you confronted your shadow? Thomas hesitated. I've analyzed it academically, Elena smiled. That's like studying maps without ever taking the journey. The truth in her words unsettled him. Despite years of intellectual engagement with Jung's concepts, Thomas had kept a safe distance from the deeper psychological work. His understanding was cerebral, not lived. The shadow isn't just our darkness, Elena continued. It's also where we've hidden our unlived life, our unrealized potential. As the sun set over the lake, Thomas felt the first stirrings of something beyond intellectual curiosity or physical attraction, a recognition that in Elena he might have found someone who could guide him toward parts of himself he'd long avoided. 2. Months after returning from Zurich, Thomas found himself video calling Elena regularly. Their conversations had evolved beyond professional exchange into a deep friendship tinged with something more. When Elena mentioned she was presenting at a conference in Boston, just an hour from Thomas's university, the opportunity to reconnect in person seemed like fate. Their dinner stretched into hours of conversation, culminating in a walk through the Boston Common under a canopy of stars. When Elena took his hand, the connection felt both exhilarating and somehow inevitable. I've been thinking about Jung's concept of projection, Thomas said, as they sat on a bench near the pond. How we project our anima or animus onto those we're attracted to. Elena turned to face him. Are you analyzing what's happening between us, Professor? Her tone was teasing, but her eyes were serious. Maybe I'm trying to understand it, Understanding is important, she said. But Jung also warned about using intellectual analysis to avoid authentic experience. Sometimes we need to live first and analyze later. As they kissed for the first time, Thomas wondered how much of what he felt was genuine connection and how much was projection, seeing in Elena the embodiment of his anima, his own feminine soul. But as her hand touched his face, theoretical questions dissolved into the warmth of human contact. Their relationship blossomed over the following months, bridging continents through video calls, texts, and occasional visits. Elena received a visiting professorship at a university near Thomas, allowing them to deepen their connection beyond the initial projection and idealization. Jung spoke of relationships as alchemical vessels, Elena said one evening as they prepared dinner in Thomas's apartment. Places where two people can transform each other through honest engagement. Thomas smiled, chopping vegetables with methodical precision. The conjunctio, the alchemical wedding of opposites. Exactly, but the true work begins after the initial attraction, after we start seeing beyond our projections. As they settled into more routine aspects of relationship, managing different work schedules, negotiating small preferences, revealing vulnerabilities, Thomas began experiencing uncomfortable emotions he'd long suppressed. Possessiveness when Elena connected easily with others, irritation at small habits, fear when she spoke of eventually returning to Switzerland. "What you're experiencing," Elena said during one difficult conversation, "is your projections beginning to withdraw. You're starting to see me as I am, not just as your anima figure. And that means confronting your own unconscious content." The process was uncomfortable but transformative. Each conflict became an opportunity to recognize and integrate aspects of himself he'd previously denied. His need for control, his fear of abandonment, his tendency to intellectualize emotions rather than feel them. 8 months into their relationship, the initial euphoria had evolved into something more complex but no less meaningful. Thomas had begun his own therapy with a Jungian analyst, taking Elena's challenge to do the inner work seriously. This inner exploration brought unexpected challenges to their relationship. As Thomas confronted aspects of his shadow, the parts of himself he'd long denied, these elements sometimes manifested in his interactions with Elena. During a weekend retreat in Vermont, a seemingly minor disagreement about their future plans escalated into Thomas's first experience of genuine rage in her presence. The intensity of his emotions shocked them both. "I'm sorry," he said after, shaken by the force of feelings he'd spent a lifetime suppressing. "I don't know where that came from." Elena's response surprised him. "I'm not afraid of your anger, Thomas. I'm more concerned about how long you've denied it exists." That night, he dreamed of a dark figure following him through familiar landscapes that somehow felt threatening. When he described the dream to Elena, she nodded knowingly. "Your shadow is becoming conscious," she said. "Jung would say that's progress, even though it doesn't feel like it." "What if you don't like what emerges?" he asked, voicing his deepest fear. "Real love isn't about liking everything about someone," she replied. "It's about seeing them wholly and choosing them anyway." As Thomas continued his inner work, cracks began appearing in Elena's seemingly integrated self. During a holiday visit to her family in Switzerland, Thomas witnessed her transformation around her critical father and passive mother. Her confidence diminished, her authentic voice muted. "You become a different person around them," he observed gently as they walked through her childhood neighborhood. "We all wear masks," she replied defensively. "Jung called it the persona, the face we show the world. But you've always emphasized authenticity." "Theory is easier than practice," she admitted, revealing vulnerabilities she'd kept hidden. "I teach what I most need to learn." This glimpse behind Elena's professional persona initiated a new phase in their relationship. Thomas began seeing beyond his projection of her as the realized self to the complex, sometimes contradictory woman she actually was. Brilliant but insecure, compassionate yet sometimes judgmental, spiritually attuned while struggling with materialistic desires. Rather than diminishing his feelings, this more complete vision deepened them. There was something profoundly intimate about being allowed to see beyond each other's carefully constructed personas. Perhaps this is what Jung meant by real relationship, Thomas reflected one evening. Not two people wearing masks or projecting ideals, but two authentic selves meeting, shadow aspects and all. Elena smiled, squeezing his hand. The Swiss would call it seeing with the heart. As their second year together approached, both Thomas and Elena had grown tremendously through their relationship. Thomas had become more emotionally accessible, less rigid in his thinking, more willing to engage with the symbolic and intuitive aspects of life. Elena had confronted her people-pleasing tendencies, her fear of genuine intimacy, her habit of hiding vulnerability behind intellectual brilliance. Yet their individual growth began creating unexpected distance between them. Thomas received an opportunity to study at Jung's original institute in Küsnacht for a year, a dream he couldn't ignore. Elena was offered a position leading a new therapy center in Santiago, reconnecting with her Chilean roots. Jung would say, "We're being called to continue our individuation journeys," Elena said, as they discussed their diverging paths. The process of becoming our authentic selves. But does individuation have to mean separation? Thomas asked, fear edging his voice. Elena's eyes held both love and sadness. Not necessarily, but sometimes the growth two people need takes them in different directions. They decided to pursue their separate opportunities while maintaining their relationship long distance. Yet as weeks turned to months, their communications reflected growing differences in perspective. Thomas was immersing himself in the symbolic, archetypal dimensions of the psyche, while Elena's work in Chile was becoming increasingly practical and community-focused. "I'm beginning to understand Jung's concept of individuation as a lonely path," Thomas confessed during a late-night call. "The more I become myself, the harder it is to explain my inner world to anyone, even you." "Perhaps," Elena suggested. "That's the tragedy Jung recognized in human love. We crave complete union, but true psychological development requires becoming distinctly ourselves." During a brief reunion in Paris, a middle point between their separate worlds, Thomas and Elena confronted the growing distance between them. Though their physical connection remained strong, something essential had shifted. Jung believed all love begins as projection, Elena said, as they sat in a small cafe near the Seine. "We fall in love with our own unconscious content reflected in another person," Thomas nodded. "The anima projected onto a suitable carrier." But he also believed that real love only becomes possible when those projections are withdrawn, when we see the other person as they truly are, separate from our psychological needs. The painful irony wasn't lost on either of them. Their relationship had facilitated the psychological growth that was now driving them apart. As they each became more individuated, more fully themselves, the complementary aspects that had initially drawn them together no longer fit as neatly. "Perhaps the illusion is necessary," Thomas suggested. "Maybe we need to believe in perfect union to undertake the journey at all." Elena's eyes filled with tears. Like the alchemists needed to believe in literal gold to discover psychological transformation. They walked along the river in silence, holding hands and confronting the possibility that their relationship had served its purpose in both their journeys. Not as the destination, but as the crucible for transformation. Back in their respective worlds, Thomas and Elena began the painful process of consciously uncoupling. Unlike the unconscious separations of their past relationships, they approach this transition with the psychological awareness they'd developed together. Jung might say, "We're experiencing the withdrawal of projections," Thomas said during one difficult conversation, "seeing each other and ourselves more clearly, and recognizing that what we need now is different from what brought us together," Elena added. They created a ritual for their ending, acknowledging the psychological significance of conscious closure. Meeting at a neutral location, a small inn in the Berkshires, where they'd once spent a happy weekend, they spent 3 days reviewing their journey together, expressing gratitude for what they'd given each other, and grieving what was ending. The tragic truth about love, Elena reflected as they sat by a fire on their final evening together, isn't that it ends, it's that it changes us so fundamentally that we sometimes grow beyond the relationship that transformed us. Thomas felt the truth in her words. Jung would probably say that's not tragedy but the purpose. Relationships as vehicles for individuation. "Still feels tragic from here," she said with a sad smile. "Perhaps the tragedy is in our expectation that love should be permanent in a world where everything, including ourselves, is constantly changing." As they parted the next morning, their embrace held both profound gratitude and genuine grief, a fully conscious goodbye between two people who had seen and accepted each other as they truly were. The months following their separation brought Thomas into deeper relationship with himself. He returned to America, bringing with him new perspectives from his time at Jung's Institute. His academic work evolved to include more emphasis on lived experience alongside theoretical understanding. He began leading workshops that integrated intellectual understanding of Jungian concepts with experiential components, active imagination, dream work, artistic expression. His students noted a new quality in his teaching, a vulnerability and authenticity that made the material more accessible. Occasionally, he received updates about Elena through mutual colleagues. She had expanded her therapy center to include community outreach programs, addressing collective trauma in post-dictatorship Chile. Her approach integrated Jungian depth psychology with social justice frameworks. Though the pain of their separation had softened, Thomas still experienced moments of questioning. Had they given up too easily? Was the growth they'd experienced separately worth the loss of what they'd shared? During a particularly intense period of questioning, he dreamed of Jung himself, sitting across from him in a therapy room. The purpose of relationship is not permanence, the dream, Jung told him. It is transformation. You have not failed. You have succeeded magnificently. Thomas woke with tears streaming down his face, feeling a profound sense of completion. Their relationship hadn't failed. It had fulfilled exactly the purpose it was meant to serve in both their journeys. 5 years after their separation, Thomas received an invitation to speak at a conference in Santiago where Elena was organizing a panel on Jungian approaches to collective healing. The prospect of seeing her again awakened complex emotions, curiosity, anxiety, lingering attachment, and a new emotion he eventually identified as genuine goodwill, independent of personal desire. When they finally met in the conference hotel lobby, Thomas was struck by how simultaneously familiar and different Elena appeared. The same soulful eyes and expressive hands, but a new confidence in her bearing, silver threads now running through her dark hair. Their conversation over dinner flowed, with the ease of old friends who have shared significant history, yet without the charged undercurrent that had once existed between them. They updated each other on their work, their personal growth, their current lives. "I've been reflecting on Jung's concept of the temenos, the sacred container," Elena said as they walked through Santiago's evening streets. "I've come to believe that some relationships aren't meant to last forever, but are instead perfect containers for specific phases of our growth." Thomas nodded. Our culture lacks frameworks for honoring completed relationships, connections that were profound and necessary, but not permanent. Exactly. We have rituals for beginnings and even for endings, but none for acknowledging transformative relationships that have fulfilled their purpose. As they stood at a viewpoint overlooking the city lights, with the Andes rising dark against the night sky, Thomas felt a profound sense of completion. The love they had shared had not failed by ending. It had succeeded by transforming them both. Perhaps the tragic truth Jung recognized about love wasn't that it ends, Thomas said, but that we expect it to remain unchanged when its very purpose is to change us. Elena smiled. And perhaps the illusion isn't love itself, but our expectation that anything in the human experience can be permanent. They parted that evening not as former lovers mourning what was lost, but as fellow travelers honoring what had been found, two individuals who had helped each other become more fully themselves, through the temporary, transformative illusion of love.